So one thing in SharePoint about retrieving items from lists is that there's many ways to do it for managed code. And then also many ways of doing it for other types of clients via the various service APIs. One of the easiest ways to work with every item in a list is to enumerate the SPList.items property. And that's definitely one way to do it, but it's also a very not a very performant way of doing it, unless you have a small items of, if you have a small number of items in your list, then that's fine. But if you're going to have like hundreds or thousands of items in a list, then it's probably not the way to go. Another way to do it is if you just need to get a single item, is you can call getItemById. And that's very performant. Another way of doing it is if you're in a UI context and you happen to be working with a list item, you can just call the SPContext current list item. So a place where this might be applicable is if you developed a custom list form, then that would be a good place to use this because you would have that context of the list item already there, and then you could just call this and not have to make any additional calls. So when you need to work with a subset of list items, you should only retrieve the items that you need, and you do that with a query instead of enumerating through every single item in the list. What you can do is you can retrieve items that are based on parameters with a CAML query, or you can also use SPLINQ. And there's more. So CAML queries this is one thing that makes working with list data different from most data access technologies, is that the mechanism that you use to query the data. So SharePoint uses what's called CAML, which stands for Collaborative Application Manipulation Language. And CAML is just the simple set of schemas that define the XML that you use to define the various site elements, which you're already familiar, such as features, site definitions, and solution manifests. But a CAML query is an XML string that contains query instructions. And so its syntax doesn't really resemble traditional SQL, but its structure and functionality is pretty similar. So in other words, it lets you specify the fields, conditions, sort order, and more. Just like you have in SQL, you have a select, you have select clause, where clause, order by clauses. Now the primary classes that support CAML queries in SharePoint are the SPQuery class, so that's the most basic one, and then the SiteDataQuery and cross-list query info. So SPQuery is more, that can only be used for a single list. So if you're just querying a single list, you can use SPQuery. Now if you're querying across several lists in a site collection or in a site, let's say for example maybe you want to query all document libraries, then you would use a SPSiteDataQuery. And then there's also the cross-list query info. That's only available in the server version. That's not available in the foundation version of SharePoint. So all these are using CAML, that's XML-based query language. The CAML query syntax also defines views. So the first class that we talked about, the SPQuery class, allows us to retrieve an instance of an SPList item collection from a single list. So that's the distinguishing point of the SPQuery, based on a CAML query. And it has multiple properties to specify the result set. Now the results that you get back, since you're getting back an instance of an SPList item collection, those results are updatable. So you can actually iterate through those items and do updates on them. Now the SPSiteDataQuery class, that's often referred to as a cross-site query, because you're able to query across multiple sites within the same site collection. So you can query multiple lists that are in multiple webs. So the example like I gave is maybe you want to query all document libraries in your site collection. That's perfect use for SPSiteDataQuery class. And the scope is configurable. Maybe you want to scope it at the site collection, maybe the current site. It's up to you. The difference with SPSiteDataQuery, instead of returning the SP list item collection, which is updatable, it's going to just return an ADO.NET data table. Now, ADO.NET, the data table class, is completely separated from its data source, so it's just a container of data. So it's basically, you're getting read-only data back. So you can't directly update things because they're in that data table, but you could take the IDs that were in that data table and then later on get a list item from that ID and do an update. Both the SPQuery and the SPSiteDataQuery classes share a number of properties that define the query's fields. So first one would be ViewFields. Just like think of it as a SQL select clause. You're able to tell the query what fields you want returned. So that's important because sometimes lists have a lot of fields, and if you only need one field, it's better just to specify that one field so it's not using as many resources. And then there's the actual query property. This is the actual CAML query. So this is where you're passing in that CAML query string. Query class also has a row limit property. So you can restrict the number of rows that the query returns. And then the ViewFields property, we've already looked at that in the last demo, but it's basically, it's an XML list of fields to return in the query, and if you look at the following code, it looks amazingly similar to how when we create content types and we use field refs, and they are the exact same elements. So at least we're getting a little bit of reuse here. We're familiar with creating content types and we're using field refs, and that's what we're doing here with the ViewFields property. This is a typical query property where we're going to sort by the file leaf ref field, and which is basically that it's in a document library and it's the file name. And what we're looking for here is all content types that are of type document, and then we want them to begin with, their title needs to begin with the value doc or doc. We saw the begins with operator right there. There's several other begins with. There's equals, contains, several to choose from. So the SPSiteDataQuery has two additional properties that you can use to restrict the result set, lists and webs. So you can use the list property to specify a base type or a server template. So server template would be like the template for a document library, which is I believe, I think that's 100. No, I think the custom list is 100. But that enumeration that we used before for when we were creating a list programmatically, that's the same enumeration here for the server template. And you can also use one or more specific list IDs if you know what they are. If you don't specify what you want for the webs property, it's just going to use the current web. If you specify site collection, then it's going to use all the webs in the site collection. And this one I think is pretty important. If you know that where the content lives in the hierarchy of the sites in your site collection, you could start at a particular web and just make it recurse all the way down through the child webs. So right now we're going to look at creating a CAML query inside of Visual Studio. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have the same solution here, and I've gone ahead and actually added a new web part called item query, and it's blank, and it has a method get items that's not filled out yet. Another thing I did was I populated some data in the products table. So we have a data set to work with, so we can query that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the products list. And first of all, actually I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. So let's modify get items, and we're going to create an SPQuery. I'm just set it to an empty string for now, and same thing with the view fields. So we'll get a handle to our list, products list. We'll just use SP context. And I know the list's products list name is products, so we'll just reference it by name. So we're going to call get items, and we're going to pass in the query that we just created. We have that stubbed out. The next thing we need to do is, we have this query kind of stubbed out, and instead of doing this query in the view fields by hand, I'm going to go ahead and create a view. So I'm going to the products list and go to list settings, and we'll create a view. And we'll choose standard view. And we'll call it reorder. And the fields we want are vendor, we want title, vendor, and quantity, so that's fine. And then we want to, I'm going to scroll down and I want to sort by title. And then I want to put a filter on this. So this is a view that's going to let us know when we need to reorder. So I'm going to show the items when quantity is less than or equal to 0. And I'll click OK, or save. Click OK here to save that. And now you can see the products are showing up that sorted by title that have quantity of less than or equal to 0. Now what we're going to do is go back to Visual Studio, go into Server Explorer, so we're in our products list, and we're going to go to the views. Probably need to refresh this. Let's drill back down into it. Products, views. There's our new view right there. And I'm going to go to the properties window, so I'm going to pop that up, and then I'm going to go to the HTML schema XML property. I'm going to copy that on the clipboard. Then I'm just going to open up Notepad. Paste that in. Let's just format this a little bit so we can see a little bit better what we're doing. There's our order by. Okay, so this is our query, here's our order by, then that's the end of our where clause, end of our query, and that's what we care about. So now I'm going to replace all the double quotes with single quotes in here just to make it easier to use this in our code behind. Okay, that's easy. And I'm going to go to the field ref elements here. Actually, let's just put these in a nice one string here on single line. And we're going to go back to the code. We don't need this anymore. And the view fields now, we have gotten that from the view that we just created. Now we need to get our query syntax. So put these back on one line. Actually, kind of like leaving it like that. Let's just leave it like that. Copy this in here. And so for the query, let's make it a literal string. And actually, we don't need the query tag. Take that off. Let's just bring this in here. Let's make it a little bit easier to read. Okay, now we have our CAML query. Now we need to go back to CreateChildControls. And we need to make a call to this. So we'll say we're getting a SP list item collection. And then we're going to iterate the items collection that we got back. And let's do a literal control. Display the title and the quantity. And we'll add a line break in there as well. Okay, let's make sure this compiles. Oops. There we go. Now let's compile again. Okay, we're going to deploy this. Go back to the home page. Okay, let's edit this page. I'm going to remove this web part just to save some space. And I'm going to add in the new web part we just made. And here's our web part now with the SPQuery being executed. So I'll go ahead and save this. Another thing we can do with CAML queries with SharePoint is joins. There's a property on the SPQuery object called joins, and there's different types of joins. There's inner join and left join. Just like SQL, inner join meaning there's records matching on the two tables that you're joining. You want the records included that only the records included that match. And then left join would be where you want one side, you want all the records, and then the other side would be only the records that match. To do a join with a CAML query, it does require that the field that you're joining on needs to be connected with a lookup column. So in our case, we have the products list, and the vendor column is a lookup column going to the vendors list. And with projections, what that means is once we do the join, instead of just specifying the view fields, we can do projections to say what fields we want to show up from the join list. So that's designated by the projected fields property of the SPQuery object. And then we can add those project fields to the view fields property for inclusion in the results. So right now we'll go ahead and create a CAML query with joins in our existing project. Okay, we're back in our project solution for CAML queries, and we're inside the item query web part. And I'm going to add our joins CAML string here. So we'll call it joins. And we'll make it a literal string. This will be an inner join. And the list alias that we're joining to is vendors. And we want to join where need to use the field ref element here, where the name equals vendor, and then the ref type is going to be the ID field. And just copy this here for the list is going to be vendors, and then the name will be ID. So the name that we're joining to in the vendors list is ID, products list, the field name is vendor. Okay, so now we have the join set up, so now we'll add our projected fields. This projected field is a name that we're going to create inside our query. So it doesn't actually exist, but it's kind of like a computed field. We're going to make the query return this as a result of our join. Okay, so now we'll just add these properties to the query instance that we have. So query.joins is going to equal our joins. And query.projectedFields equals projected fields. Okay, so one thing we need to do here is we are projecting the full name field, but we need to include the full name field in our view field. So let me go ahead and add that to the view field. So I'll just copy this existing one and then just change the name to full name. Save that. And then we just need to modify the what we're rendering on the screen. So we'll make this we'll just add the full name here as well. Okay, we'll just make sure that compiles. Okay, looks good. And let's go ahead and deploy. And we'll go ahead and run this. And here's the results. So now you can see we have the full name is showing up now. So we are projecting the full name field, but it's a lookup field, so you can see we're getting the ID and the title value. So what we want to do to clean that up, let's go back into our code and we need to use the SPLookupValue class to go ahead and parse this lookup field for us. So it's going to take the full string value that we saw on the screen, parse that, and then it's going to parse it in. It basically splits up the lookup ID and the lookup value. We want the lookup value. So we'll save that and we'll go ahead and deploy this again. And close this and run this again. So now we're getting what we want. Now we're seeing the now we got the full name, but we're just showing the title from that lookup field, and that's exactly what we want. So we've been looking at different ways of getting data out of SharePoint, and the last way we were looking at was with CAML. Now we're going to look at leveraging Linq, and there is actually a SharePoint-Linq provider called SPLink. There's an implementation of this in the Microsoft.SharePoint.Linq assembly. And also there's a command line tool that's in the SharePoint roots bin folder in the 15 hive called spmetal.exe that will allow you to, at the command line, you can point it to the URL for your site and then tell it what the name of the file that you want to create, what namespace, and it'll actually generate entity classes that model all of the lists in your SharePoint site. So most SharePoint collections are IEnumerable, and so they support linked objects. So linked objects, that's just the standard link. You get an IEnumerable collection, and you can do all the standard linked methods like .where, .count, all of those types of link expressions that you're used to using. And SharePoint also includes SPLink. And so the whole point of SPLink is it allows us to do LINQ queries as an alternative to CAML. So LINQ actually stands for Language Integrated Query. So basically what it means is we're using the object model to query SharePoint instead of having to use sophisticated CAML. And again, with SPMetal, we can generate the entity classes that we need. So that's what, when we do our queries, we're going to be using those entity classes, and we'll get back instances of those, or collections of those entity classes when we execute the LINQ queries. And we'll use those entities when we write our queries. What the LINQ provider does is it's actually just generating and executing CAML behind the scenes. So if you did do a LINQ query and didn't really like the results, you could go ahead and just switch back to straight CAML. And maybe there might be times where your CAML query may be more efficient than what LINQ to SharePoint generates for you. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our Visual Studio solution, and we're going to create a web part that does a LINQ query on our List Demos project. So the first thing we need to do if we want to use a LINQ query is we need to use the SPMetal utility so we can generate an entity model for the lists in our site. So what I've done is, to save time, I've actually copied the command line that we're going to run. So we're going to run, this lives in the 15 bin, and it's the spmetal.exe is the name of the executable we're going to run against, and the web parameter, that's going to be our server name here, and then our namespace, we'll keep it the same as in our project, which is list demos. And then code, I'm just going to create a file called model.cs. So I'm going to go jump out to a command prompt. I'm going to make sure I run this as administrator. And I'm going to jump back down into the root, because because I'm just saying create file model.cs, it's going to create it wherever our command prompt is located. So that way it'll just be on the C drive. I'll be able to pull it out of there pretty easy. So I'm going to copy this. We'll paste this in here. We'll let this run. Close this down. And once this finishes, I can go ahead and, oh, looks like it finished. Okay. And I'm going to go and pull that model file out, and I can bring that into our project. So I'll just copy that in. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is I'm going to open up this file. And the first thing you see is a bunch of red squigglies because we can't, the link namespace is not found. That's because we need to set a reference in our project to SharePoint.Linq, so, or the Microsoft.SharePoint.Linq assembly. So let me go back to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to References. I'm just going to browse to the 15 folder. And here's our assembly, Microsoft.SharePoint.Linq. So it's in the 15 hive under ISAPI, where most of the assemblies for SharePoint are located. So we'll include that reference. And now you can see everything being resolved. I'm going to add a new web part here to the project. And let's call it Link Query. So I'm going to go into CreateChildControls, and first thing I'm going to do is grab a context, the data context for our model. And we need to initialize it, so we can use the SP context here since we're inside of a web part. And we don't care about object tracking, so we're going to turn that off because we're just going to be reading, we're not going to be writing. And that's going to help improve performance as well. Okay, let's go ahead and get a products list here. Forgot to put the using on top of this file here. We need to add a using statement for link and SharePoint.Linq. Okay, now we're getting the IntelliSense. All right, much better. So now we have our list. So what we're going to do here is just, we're going to add a literal control for every product in the list. Put a line break there. Okay, so we're just going to iterate through list, write the name and the quantity of the product out. So now I'm going to go ahead and we'll build and deploy this solution. Okay, I forgot to start Visual Studio as administrator, so let me just go ahead and do that. And we'll come back to our project. So now we're logged in as administrator. We started Visual Studio as administrator, so we can do our deploy. Go ahead and get the web page fired up while it's deploying and activating the features. Okay, that succeeded. Let's wait for the page and we'll put our web part on the page and see if it works. Okay, let's go edit this page. I'm going to remove the old web part here. And we'll put our new web part in here. There's our link query web part. And looks like it's working. So you can see this is kind of a nice compact piece of code here, and there's not a lot of text you see from the CAML query. It's nice and concise, and it's just all object oriented. So this is definitely a nice abstraction over SharePoint. So you can see from that demo that Linq is a pretty useful tool. It does definitely make code more compact and more readable when querying against SharePoint lists. But there's also some limitations. So the CAML that Linq generates may or may not work as well as CAML that you create directly. So if there's some type of special, maybe you don't want to pull back all the columns in a query, you only need one column or something like that, something special that you need to do and where performance is critical, then it may not be a good choice. Probably, I could see that happening a lot with joins. One of the other limitations is this doesn't work with the client-side object model. Client-side object model, it uses CAML, so you do have to pass CAML with your queries, and then it's just using link to object. So just standard link, system.link is what you see. So just all the normal stuff that you do often IEnumerable.